They say a single man dared to defy the mightiest empire in Europe and chose freedom at the cost of his life. Imagine Scotland's cold mist, bagpipes beneath the Highland rain. Let this tale of courage and hope guide you into sleep. Settle in comfortably and welcome to Twilight Tales. Chapter 1. The Roots of a Rebel. Part 1. The Highlands in the Breath of the Wind. Dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands in solemn silence, broken only by the whistle of the wind gliding along the heather-covered hills. A thick, almost tangible mist floated between the valleys, clinging to the gnarled trunks of pines twisted by centuries. The pale light of the sun struggled to pierce this silvery veil, and each ray that succeeded spread like a thread of gold over the dew-soaked grass. The air carried the scent of damp peat, ancient mosses, and the smoke of distant hearths. It was a harsh land, but beautiful in its raw beauty, forged by the northern winds and relentless rains. Here, nothing was given freely. Every harvest, every head of cattle, every stone of a house was the fruit of patient and arduous effort. The hills stretched endlessly into the distance, dotted with locks of dark waters that reflected the low clouds. Narrow paths wound between rocks, traced by the footsteps of men and beasts across generations. In this setting lived the Wallace family. Their house, built of carefully assembled gray stones and topped with a thick thatched roof, stood on a sheltered slope, not far from a stream whose constant murmur accompanied days and nights. The thick walls retained the warmth of the hearth, where peat from nearby marshes burned perpetually. The interior smelled of tanned leather, wool, dry wood, and bread baked on stone. Sir Malcolm Wallace, the father, was a small landowner and a respected man-at-arms in the region. He bore on his shoulders the quiet pride of those who know where they come from and what they must defend. His wife Margaret managed the household with gentle firmness, blending maternal tenderness with natural authority. Her clear eyes always seemed capable of piercing the thoughts of those who met her gaze. William, their son, was still a child, but his steps already carried him far from the walls of the house. He loved running across the grassy slopes, feeling the wind whip his face and the icy rain bead on his skin. His hands knew the roughness of mossy stones and the suppleness of young branches. He watched raptors glide above the valleys, seeking their prey with the same patience as the clan's hunters. Childhood in the Highlands was one of constant learning. Mornings began early, fetching water from the spring, feeding the animals, chopping wood, repairing tools. Every gesture, however mundane it seemed, taught something. The value of effort, attention to detail, understanding the rhythm of the seasons. But beyond daily tasks, there were the stories. In the evenings, when the wind howled around the house and rain battered the shutters, the clan's elders gathered by the fire. They recounted epics of past heroes, battles against invaders from the south or the sea, oaths kept at the cost of blood. The deep voices, the crackling of flames, and the dancing shadows of faces etched these tales into the children's memories. William listened in silence, eyes wide, as if he could see those scenes unfold through the words. But these stories spoke not only of glory and victory. They also recalled defeats, betrayals, burned villages, and stolen lands. They taught that freedom was a fragile thing, always threatened, and that each generation must be ready to defend it anew. One autumn evening, Sir Malcolm took William to the summit of a nearby hill. The sky was ablaze. Red and gold clouds stretched across the horizon, and the light spilled over the valleys like a blessing. There, at the foot of an old cairn erected by their ancestors, his father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Look, William," he said, "everything you see belongs to those who shed their blood so we could live free. This is not just land, it is our heritage, a heritage not given, but defended." The boy nodded. He did not yet grasp the full weight of those words, but he felt their gravity, like a silent oath etched deep within him. The days passed, marked by work and seasons. In winter, they learned to move through snow, track animals, and find safe shelter in the frozen hills. In summer, they worked the fields, tended pastures, and repaired fences. William followed his father and uncles, absorbing every skill passed down, every technique, every trick to survive in a land that forgave no weakness. But over the years, another wind began to blow, colder, more menacing. English patrols appeared on the roads. They carried foreign banners and demanded provisions, livestock, or lodging. Sometimes they stayed for days in a village, leaving behind a mix of fear and resentment. The fireside discussions grew more cautious, the glances more wary. One afternoon, returning alone from a hunt, William spotted black smoke rising behind a hill. Guided by a gnawing unease, he approached. What he found scarred his memory: a farm reduced to ashes, livestock slaughtered, the ground blackened by fire. The hoofprints and debris left behind left no doubt. English soldiers had passed through. That evening, he sat silently by the fire for a long time. His mother finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "One day, William, you will have to choose, to endure or to act." Those simple, heavy words echoed in him long after, and in the nights that followed, as he fell asleep to the sound of the wind whistling through the pines, he sometimes seemed to hear a murmur as if from far away, a single word repeated tirelessly: freedom. Part 2. The Learning of Freedom. The seasons followed one another, gradually shaping William's body and mind. In the Highlands, growing up was not a matter of carelessness. It was constant learning, a slow forging that the elders conducted with the patience of stones. Each day brought its lesson, and each lesson imprinted itself in gestures, muscles, and memory. Mornings began before the sun fully rose. Sir Malcolm roused his son from sleep, and the two stepped out into the crisp air, their steps stirring the dew from the tall grass. They often walked in silence, for his father had taught him that an attentive ear perceives more than a distracted eye. In the woods, William learned to recognize the faint snap of a branch under a deer's hoof, or the sudden silence that signals a predator's presence. Hunting became his first school of patience. The longbow, carved from carefully selected yew, rested against his shoulder like a promise. He learned to draw the string with a steady hand, to feel the tension in his fingers and shoulders, to hold his breath just long enough for the arrow to fly in a perfect arc. Days spent tracking game, blending into the shadows of pines or crawling through damp grass forged in him the silent endurance that distinguishes a hunter from a mere shooter. But the bow was only a beginning. The art of combat held a central place in a clan son's education. Away from the village, on a patch of ground marked by standing stones, Sir Malcolm, his brothers, and a few elders trained the young in arms. William first learned with the staff, mastering how to strike, parry, and feint. Poorly aimed blows earned immediate correction, a sharp tap that stung hands and pride. Then came the training sword, heavy and poorly balanced, designed to strengthen muscles and force the right movement. The claymore, long and demanding, was a revelation to him. It required as much strength as suppleness, and each strike had to be executed as a complete motion, where the body's balance mattered as much as the power of the arms. His hands grew calloused, his forearms gained solidity, and his movements precision. The shield completed this training. Large, circular, often adorned with the clan's colors, it served to absorb blows, but also to strike. William learned to use it not as mere protection, but as a weapon capable of destabilizing, opening a gap. Exercises involved alternating sword strikes and shield charges, staying mobile despite the weight. Training days often ended around the fire, with elders recounting past battles. These stories were not just for entertainment. They carried lessons of strategy, courage, and caution. They spoke of heroes who stood against overwhelming forces, but also of fatal mistakes made by those who underestimated their enemy. Among these voices, that of his uncle Argyle resonated with force. Argyle had traveled beyond the borders, fought in distant campaigns. He spoke of seas covered with ships, cities with white walls, armies from lands so far away they could only be named in legends. But every tale always returned to the same idea. No matter the enemy's grandeur, William, he said, what matters is the cause you fight for. And if that cause is just, it will give you the strength to hold on when all seems lost. William's adolescence unfolded under this dual teaching, that of the weapon and that of the mind. Technical mastery had meaning only if it served a purpose greater than oneself. During winter evenings, his mother, Margaret, completed this heritage by passing down the clan's memory, the names of ancestors, the stories of their alliances, the promises they had made and kept at the cost of their lives. But the world was changing, and the English threat grew more pressing. Patrols now passed more frequently on the roads, demanding provisions and lodging. Their presence cast a quiet tension over the villages. People lowered their voices when soldiers were near, and children were taught not to respond to provocations. William observed. He saw how the soldiers behaved, their arrogant confidence, the way they looked at houses as if they already owned them. One evening, while bringing back firewood, he asked his father why they didn't drive them out. Because striking too soon is to lose before you've even begun, Sir Malcolm replied. Anger is a blade. If you wield it without thought, it turns against you. But if you sharpen it patiently, when the day comes, it will cut clean. In the spring, William joined his first great boar hunt. It was both a physical and mental trial. The beast, tracked through the forest, finally charged with impressive force. William, positioned on the flank, leaped aside at the last moment and drove his spear into the animal's side. The shock reverberated through his arm. When they returned to the village, his father placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare sign of recognition. The years passed, and with them the shadow grew. William increasingly understood that the freedom his parents and uncles spoke of was not a given. It was fragile, threatened, and required constant vigilance. The wind of the Highlands sometimes seemed to whisper the same thing as his father. Prepare yourself. And in those whispers there was a silent promise. The day would come when he would have to rise, not for himself alone, but for all those who shared this land. Part 3. The Spark of Rebellion. The years passed, and William, now a young man, had taken on the stature of those hardened by life in the Highlands. His shoulders were broad, his hands marked by work and training, his gaze darker than before. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, something simmered. The English occupation, once diffuse, grew increasingly oppressive. Patrols no longer merely passed through, they camped, inspected, taxed. Foreign banners flew over hastily built forts, and the sharp cutting orders of officers echoed even in remote villages. Rumors spread quickly. A local lord had been stripped of his lands for refusing to swear allegiance to King Edward. Another had seen his son taken by force to serve in a distant garrison. One morning, William accompanied his father to the market in a nearby town. The square, usually noisy and lively, had lost its warmth. English soldiers, armed and armored, stood guard near the central well. Their gazes roamed the crowd with cold familiarity, as if everything here already belonged to them. One, sneering, knocked over an old woman's basket, letting her apples roll into the mud. William took a step forward, but felt his father's firm hand on his arm. A brief exchange of glances was enough. Not here, not now. The following weeks were marked by more direct humiliations. An English officer, claiming to collect a late tax, arrived at the family farm with 6 men. They took a horse, 2 sacks of grain, and struck a servant too slow to obey. William, returning from the hunt, found his mother in tears and his father sitting, his face frozen in tense silence. That night, William lay awake, staring at the low ceiling of his room, jaws clenched. Then tragedy took a familiar face. In the village of Lanark lived Marion Braidfute, a young woman William had known since childhood. They had grown closer over the years, sharing the same indignation at English abuses. But one evening, while William was away, Marion was attacked by men of the local sheriff, William Heselrigg. On the pretext that she had aided rebels, they took her. What followed was brutal, and when a messenger brought the news to William, she had succumbed to her wounds. It was as if the world shrank around him, leaving only a single burning point: vengeance. But this anger was not a blind impulse. It focused, took shape, became a blade ready to strike. The next night, he gathered a few trusted men. They marched long in silence, their silhouettes blending into the shadows of the trees. The sheriff's manor stood at the center of a torch-lit courtyard. Wallace gave his orders with a gesture. Archers neutralized the sentries. Then, with a single motion, they scaled the palisade. The clash of metal rang out, followed by muffled cries. William found Heselrigg in his quarters. The Englishman barely had time to rise before the claymore came down. Blood splattered the carpets and walls, overturned torches set fire to the drapes, and soon the entire manor was ablaze. The flames rose high into the night sky, lighting the valley like a bonfire of revolt. This was no longer just vengeance. It was an act of war. The next day, the English launched a large-scale manhunt. Roads were watched, houses searched. Gold was offered to anyone who would deliver William Wallace. But he was no longer alone. Men came to him alone or in small groups. Some had lost loved ones, others their lands. All shared the same rage. Wallace welcomed them not as a distant leader, but as a brother in arms. Together, they began striking the enemy where least expected, isolated detachments, poorly guarded convoys, careless patrols. One night, gathered around a fire hidden in a clearing, William spoke to his companions. His deep voice carried in the cold air, "We have neither their numbers nor their gold, but we have what they will never have, the conviction that this land is ours. If we do not defend it, no one will do it for us." A silence followed, then a murmur of approval which grew into a roar. That evening, a vow was silently sealed. The Scottish hills became their refuge and ally. They hid their tracks, amplified their war cries, echoed the sounds of battle to sow confusion. Each victory, however small, swelled their ranks and fed the legend. And in taverns and cottages alike, the name of William Wallace began to be whispered with a new tone, no longer just as a man, but as a cause. Chapter 2. The Sword and the Flame. Part 1. First Blood. The morning air was sharp, almost cutting, carrying the mingled scent of damp earth and crushed heather that heralded a day heavy with meaning. Wallace's men stood concealed, scattered among the rocks and thickets lining the narrow pass of a gorge. Below, the road wound between two steep cliffs, forming a perfect bottleneck for an ambush. It was a place chosen with care, where nature itself seemed to set a trap. For days, scouts had brought precise reports. An English convoy was leaving Stirling to join an isolated garrison in the north. 6 wagons loaded with provisions, barrels of salt, weapons, and silver coins, escorted by some 20 soldiers. For Wallace, it was an ideal target. Not only would the loot be useful, but the attack would strike the English where they felt safe, on their own roads. The plan was simple. Let the vanguard pass, trap them in the defile, strike hard and fast, then vanish before reinforcements could arrive. The men knew their roles. Archers, positioned high above, awaited Wallace's signal. Close combat fighters waited in the shadows, fingers gripping the wood of their spears or the hilts of their swords. The silence was tense. Only the rustle of wind in the ferns and, faintly, the trickle of a nearby stream could be heard. Wallace, crouched behind a granite boulder, watched the road. He could almost feel the ground's vibration under his feet. The rumble of wheels and hooves was approaching. The first horsemen appeared, dark silhouettes against the gray stone. Their chain mail glinted intermittently when a sunray pierced the clouds. Behind them, the wagons advanced at the heavy pace of draft horses, escorted by foot soldiers. The English faces, confident, seemed oblivious to the danger. Wallace slowly raised his hand, palm open to the sky. The archers drew their bows, holding their breath. Then, with a sharp gesture, he lowered his arm. The first volley of arrows whistled through the air, embedding in throats, necks, and faces. 3 soldiers fell instantly. Shouts erupted, the escort scrambling for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. Then, like a wave crashing on the shore, the Scots surged from the rocks and bushes. The clash was brutal. Scottish spears pierced the front ranks, shields slammed against helmets, and swords fell with the force of years of pent-up resentment. Wallace, at the forefront, struck with icy precision. His claymore swept wide arcs, felling foes like ripe wheat. A horseman tried to break through. Wallace dodged, sliced the bridle straps, and the panicked horse threw its rider to the ground in a cloud of dust. The cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of combat. Horses neighed, straining vainly at their harnesses. The English tried to regroup, but the narrowness of the pass doomed them. Those in the rear couldn't advance. Those in front fell back under pressure, creating chaos where each man fought for survival. In minutes, the escort was broken. Some soldiers, panicked, threw themselves into the stream along the road, hoping to escape through the water. The icy current swept several away, their armor dragging them to the bottom. When silence finally returned, it was punctuated only by the panting of men and the groans of the wounded. Wallace wiped his sword's blade on a fallen soldier's tunic, then ordered the wagons searched. Provisions were quickly divided among the men. Some would be sent to nearby villages. The seized weapons would arm recruits. The silver would be kept to buy reinforcements and pay informants. But beyond the loot, it was the psychological impact that mattered. Wallace stood on one of the overturned wagons and addressed his men, his voice clear despite the exertion. Let them know we are not defeated. Let them know every road they think safe can become their grave. His words were followed by a powerful, wild cry. Freedom! The word rolled through the gorge like thunder, echoed off the rocky walls, and soared into the valley, carried by the wind. As they left the gorge, the men knew something had changed. This was not just a victory. It was the first blood spilled in broad daylight, an open declaration that Scotland would no longer accept the English yoke. And for Wallace, it was the certainty that the war was only beginning. Part 2. The Cry of the Hills. After the gorge ambush, William Wallace's name traveled faster than the wind, sweeping the ridges. In hamlets clinging to slopes at market corners and in smoky taverns, people whispered of a Scot who had dared strike the enemy on their own roads and lived to tell it. Details varied with the teller. Some said he felled 10 men single-handedly, others that he stopped a charging horse with a single grip. It mattered little whether truth mingled with legend. What mattered was that Scots remembered they were not powerless. Gradually, men began joining Wallace, first in small groups, sometimes alone, arriving from afar with only an old sword, a woodsman's axe, or a simple staff. They came from the lowlands, isolated valleys, rain-battered shores. Some bore the marks of blows from English requisitions. Others had seen their farms burned, their livestock taken, a brother or son hanged for rebellion. Each carried his anger like a burden, and Wallace knew how to turn it into a weapon. The Scottish hills became their fortress. They offered stone shelters, narrow folds where a handful of men could hide for days, ridges from which enemy patrols could be seen miles away. Wallace knew these lands from childhood, hidden paths under the heather, passages too narrow for horses, safe fords in rivers swollen by rain. Each morning he trained his men. They learned to move silently, blend into the landscape, climb steep slopes quickly, and shoot accurately even in strong winds. The youngest wielded the longbow, their fingers marked by the string, while the sturdiest practiced with pike and shield. The drills were tough, but Wallace encouraged more than he punished. He knew each man needed to feel part of a cause, not just a soldier in an army. In the evenings, makeshift camps came alive around fires. They shared bread, memories, and laughter too, despite the harshness of the days. Some played hesitant notes on a wooden flute or strummed the strings of an old harp, the music mingling with the wind's murmur. Wallace moved from group to group, listening to stories, learning names. Each man needed to know their leader saw them as a brother in arms. One day, a messenger from the south brought news that sparked a plan. An English garrison, posted in a small fort atop a hill, controlled a strategic crossroads and extorted local farmers. Monks from a nearby priory had been stripped of their barley and cheese reserves. Wallace gathered his lieutenants. They needed to strike quickly and decisively, but above all in a way that would inspire those suffering in silence. They set out at dawn, taking advantage of thick fog. The plan was simple: lure part of the garrison out of the fort, block the soldiers' return, then infiltrate a less guarded flank. Men disguised as frightened peasants came to tell the English a herd had escaped and was ruining crops in the valley. As expected, half the soldiers marched out, annoyed. Meanwhile, Wallace and his best climbers scaled the steep rear slope, their hands gripping wet rocks. The assault was swift. Sentries were neutralized before they could sound the alarm. In the courtyard, a brief fight broke out. The English sergeant tried to resist, but a shield blow sent him to the ground. The last men in the tower surrendered upon seeing Wallace's claymore raised above their defeated leader. In less than an hour, the hill changed hands. Wallace raised a makeshift banner, a hastily sewn red cloth, a symbol of defiance. The farmers were invited up, their stolen goods were returned, and the monks received their reserves intact. This gesture was worth as much as a military victory. It showed that Wallace fought not for his own glory, but to restore to his people what was theirs. 2 days later, as expected, an English troop came to retake the hill. But Wallace had rigged the slope. Felled logs blocked the path. Hidden pits awaited horses. Archers, concealed behind rocks, loosed their arrows with deadly precision. The English, disorganized, retreated, leaving several men behind. When silence fell again, Wallace gathered his men at the summit and spoke. Every hill, every valley, every stone of this land is ours. As long as we are ready to defend them, no foreign king can claim Scotland as his. A single cry rose, carried by dozens of voices. Freedom! The Highland wind carried the word far to hamlets still awaiting a sign. That day, Scotland's hills ceased to be mere landscape. They became the very voice of revolt. Part 3. The Call to the Nation. Wallace's victories, at first modest and local, began to spread like a moorland fire driven by the wind. Each successful ambush, each fort retaken from the English, each intercepted convoy added a new spark to the blaze. In villages, people recounted his exploits by the fireside, sometimes exaggerating them, but always with admiration. The elders said that since Robert Bruce, No Scot had so embodied the hope of an entire nation. But Wallace knew a handful of fighters, however valiant, could not free the country. He needed to rally, unify, give the revolt a clear direction. Scotland's clans had always been proud and divided, quick to defend their own land, but slow to unite behind a single leader. That was the barrier he had to overcome. He summoned his lieutenants to an isolated glen, out of sight. A large leather map was spread on an improvised table. Stones, serving as weights, marked known English positions, supply points, and strategic roads. Wallace placed a firm finger on Stirling. This is where we must strike. If we hold this bridge, we cut off the English route north. But to succeed, we need more than our current men. We need all of Scotland. Preparations began at once. Messengers set out for the Highlands, the Lowlands, and even the Islands. Each carried the risk of capture. Being caught meant the rope or the axe. Yet they went without hesitation, for Wallace's message was simple and struck straight to the heart. It is time for Scotland to rise. In some valleys, the response was immediate. Clan chiefs came in person, bringing sturdy men, longbows, and swords inherited from their fathers. Elsewhere, it was harder. Some families had sworn allegiance to the English king for survival, and breaking that oath could mean ruin. Wallace listened, but did not yield. There is no peace in submission. If you stand still today, tomorrow your sons will wear their colors and forget your tongue. Gradually, the ranks swelled. The hills echoed with the steps of new recruits, the clatter of practice blows on shields, the rustle of cloaks in the wind. Women contributed, too. They made bandages, prepared provisions, even forged arrowheads. The revolt ceased to be a handful of armed men. It became the breath of an entire people. Wallace visited several towns to speak directly to the people. Crowds gathered in the squares, packed tightly despite the fear of English spies. His speech was not adorned with fine phrases. He spoke as a man of the people, with the gravity of one who knows every word counts. We fight not for glory, nor for lands, nor for a throne. We fight so no one decides for us what we must be. We fight so our children grow free on the land that bore our fathers. These words struck the heart more surely than any promise of wealth. Eyes lifted, jaws clenched, and often at the end of his speeches a cry rose, spontaneous, powerful, freedom! The word rolled from mouth to mouth, filling narrow alleys like a rising tide. The English, alarmed by this fervor, reinforced their garrisons and doubled their patrols. But this only fueled the anger. Every new arrest, every public hanging became another reason to rally the undecided. Wallace knew he walked a tightrope. He had to strike hard enough to keep the flame alive, but avoid a premature battle that would break their forces. One evening, as the camp prepared to rest, Wallace climbed a rock overlooking the valley. The sky was low, heavy with clouds filtering the moonlight. He spoke to his men in a deep, steady, almost slow voice. We are more numerous today than yesterday, and tomorrow we will be more than today. But remember, it is not numbers alone that bring victory, but the faith we have in our cause. The hills, the rivers, the sea, all here belongs to us by birthright. And as long as we breathe, England cannot take it from us. A profound silence followed, as if even the wind had paused to listen. Then from the shadows of the tents, a voice answered, "For Scotland, Others joined, and soon the entire valley resounded with the cry. That night, Wallace's revolt crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just a fight of armed men. It had become the call of an entire nation awakening. Chapter 3. Freedom Forged in Fire. Part 1. Stirling Bridge, the Dance of Victory. The morning of September 11th, 1297, opened in thick fog, a gray veil draping the river forth and blurring the outlines of the surrounding hills. On the northern bank, the Scottish army waited, crouched in the damp morning air. Men tightened the straps of their armor, wiped condensation from their bows, adjusted their grip on their pikes. At the center, William Wallace, upright and silent, scanned the long wooden bridge connecting the two banks. That frail passage would be the key to the day. Across the river, on the southern bank, stretched the English force. Royal banners fluttered limply in the mist, hundreds of soldiers stamping in anticipation, horsemen and foot soldiers mingled. Sir Hugh de Cressingham, the commander-in-chief, seemed eager to engage. Wallace knew that eagerness would be his downfall. The Scottish plan was simple and bold. Let the English advance onto the bridge, narrow enough for only 2 horsemen abreast, then strike when only part had crossed, isolating the vanguard from the main army. The marshes around the northern bank made maneuvering difficult. If the English ventured in, their armor would weigh them down like stones. Wallace gave his orders in a measured, almost calm tone, as if describing a dance. Let them advance. Let them think we're retreating. When their helmets gleam in the sun on our bank, close the trap. The hours passed slowly. The sun occasionally pierced the fog, revealing silhouettes that seemed to float on the water. Then, finally, the English began to move. The first horses pounded the bridge's planks, followed by heavily armed foot soldiers. Wallace signaled his men to stand ready, but none moved. The Scots, hidden in the folds of the terrain, seemed to have vanished. The English vanguard set foot on the northern bank. One more moment, and they would be beyond reach of aid. Then Wallace lowered his hand. Suddenly, the hills came alive. Dozens of archers emerged from their positions and loosed a rain of arrows that fell upon the packed ranks. Shouts erupted, mingled with the crash of lowering pikes. Scottish pikemen charged, forming an impenetrable hedge. English horses, panicked, reared, unable to advance or retreat on the muddy ground. Behind them, other soldiers tried to cross the bridge, but it was completely jammed. The planks creaked under the weight, and some, in panic, stumbled and fell into the river, swept away by the icy current. Wallace, in the heart of the tumult, wielded his claymore with a master's precision. Each strike hit its mark. Each movement had purpose. Around him, his men shouted, "For Scotland!" their voices drowning even the wind's roar. The English vanguard was soon overwhelmed. Those trying to retreat collided with their own troops still on the bridge. The Forth's waters turned murky and reddish, carrying the broken helmets and spears. Cressingham, still on the southern bank, realized too late Wallace's ruse. Unable to reform his lines, he ordered a retreat, but the confusion was total. The Scots pressed their advantage. Some cut the bridge's planks, isolating the last English on the northern bank. Trapped, surrounded, they were forced to surrender or die there. When the tumult finally subsided, the silence seemed unreal. The fog lifted, revealing the battlefield, scattered weapons, bodies strewn, the bridge broken in its middle. The Scots, panting, looked at each other with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. They had won. Wallace gathered his men on a small rise. His voice carried deep and clear. Today, we showed that Scotland can push back an empire, but remember, this is only a battle. The war lies ahead. The men answered with a cry that shook the air. Freedom! The word crossed the river, faded into the hills, and perhaps reached the ears of peasants awaiting news far away. The victory at Stirling Bridge was not just a military success. It was a blazing symbol. The Scots had faced England on chosen ground and defeated them through cunning and determination. The story of that day would begin to spread by nightfall, and with it, the image of a leader who knew how to turn rivers and bridges into allies. Wallace, however, did not savor it. His mind was already turning to what came next. England would not let this affront go unpunished, and he knew the hardest was yet to come. Part 2. Hero of Scotland. The victory at Stirling Bridge spread through Scotland like a ripple in a still lake, gaining strength with every retelling, brilliance with every mouth that spoke it. In towns and villages, people spoke of the man who had stood against England and forced it to retreat. Children mimicked his gestures with sticks. Elders invoked his name like those of ancient heroes, and even those who still doubted found themselves hoping. Wallace, however, did not let himself be intoxicated by glory. He knew prestige was a double-edged sword. It drew support, but also the relentless attention of the enemy. He spent the following days reorganizing his forces, tending to the wounded, strengthening strategic positions. The hills around Stirling became an improvised bastion, every path and ford now watched by scouts. Soon, clan chiefs flocked to pay their respects. Some came out of conviction, others by calculation, aware that joining him could bring prestige and influence. Wallace received them all with the same blend of firmness and respect. In these meetings, he presented himself not as a king or lord, but as the guardian of Scotland, a title soon officially bestowed upon him. It was more than an honor. It was a responsibility tying his fate to that of an entire people. The ceremony took place in a great stone hall, lit by flickering torches. Banners bearing clan colors hung from the beams, and attentive faces reflected a mix of pride and gravity. An elder, his beard white as mountain snow, stepped forward with a sword and shield adorned with the Scottish saltire. He presented them to Wallace with solemn words. By the will of the clans, and in the name of the people, we recognize you as guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland, defender of its freedom and dignity. Wallace bowed his head, accepting the tribute not as a crown, but as a burden willingly taken. When he spoke, his voice was firm, almost rough. This title is not for my glory, but for our cause. As long as I breathe, I will defend this land against anyone who seeks to subdue it. But know this fight can only be won if we stay united. Old quarrels must die here today. These words hit their mark. Hands reached out. Old grudges were set aside, at least for a time. England, observing these signs of unity, realized Wallace was not just a rebel leader. He had become the face of a national movement. The following months were devoted to consolidating positions and carrying the war south. Wallace led several raids into English territory, striking quickly and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. These brief incursions left a mark. They showed Scotland was not merely defensive, but capable of taking the fight to the enemy. In liberated towns, people greeted Wallace's men with cheers and modest gifts: fresh bread, skins of ale, woven blankets. Children ran behind the horses, and some farmers spontaneously offered tools or carts to aid the war effort. Each village thus reignited became a foothold, a hearth, where the idea of freedom took root. Yet behind these victories, Wallace saw the shadow of greater challenges. The Scottish nobles, though impressed, remained wary. Many were tied to England by treaties or commercial interests. Wallace knew some would rather compromise with the enemy than risk their lands in total war. This mutual distrust he wore like invisible armor, aware it could crack at the first setback. One winter evening, as snow began to dust the hills, Wallace stood alone atop a promontory. Below, the campfires twinkled, punctuated by laughter and songs. He let his gaze wander to the horizon, where night swallowed the plains. Beyond that darkness, he knew England was already preparing its response. "We've won a battle," he murmured to himself. "But the war is only beginning." No one heard those words, but they encapsulated the man's clarity. He held no illusions about the enemy's strength or the fragility of their position. Yet, deep within, burned the certainty, as long as he stood, he would embody that breath of freedom that no empire, however powerful, could fully extinguish. That evening, as the cold wind stung his face, William Wallace was not just the guardian of the kingdom. To his people, he had become the living symbol of Scotland itself. Part 3. The Shadows of Falkirk. The summer of 1298 loomed heavy, not only with the heat lingering in the valleys, but also with the threat hanging over all of Scotland. Since Stirling, England had been preparing its retaliation. King Edward III himself was assembling a massive army, knights clad in iron, Welsh archers renowned for their deadly precision, seasoned foot soldiers. It was said every village in northern England had contributed men and supplies to this expedition. Wallace, now guardian of the kingdom, knew a clash was inevitable, but he hoped to avoid a direct confrontation. His strategy relied on mobility: harass the enemy, cut their supply lines, wear them down until they retreated on their own. However, not all shared this caution. Some Scottish nobles, eager to defend their honor, pressed for a pitched battle. Yielding to this pressure and fearing to lose their support, Wallace agreed to face the English near Falkirk, where hills and marshes could limit the advantage of their cavalry. At dawn on July the 22nd, the Scottish army took position. Wallace arranged his men in schiltrons, large circular formations bristling with long pikes, designed to break cavalry charges. Between these human circles, he placed archers and lighter infantry, marshes on one flank, a hill on the other. Everything seemed set to hold back the English tide. On the opposite side of the field, the sight was terrifying. English banners floated above a sea of armor and lances. The Welsh archers were already taking position, aligning their longbows, their quivers full. It was said These men could pierce chain mail at 200 paces. Wallace watched, outwardly impassive, but he knew those archers would be the key to the day. The clash began with a rain of arrows. Dark shafts whistled through the air before crashing into the schiltrons. The pikemen, packed tightly, endured, their shields raised, but each volley claimed lives. The Scottish archers, fewer and with shorter range, struggled to respond. Then came the English cavalry. Massive horses, ironclad, launched into a thundering charge, their hooves kicking up dust. The front ranks slammed into the Scottish pikes. Riders and mounts impaled, rolling to the ground in a mix of screams and metal. But the assaults kept coming, and each time the Scottish circles tightened further, men grunting with effort, their hands bleeding on the wood of their spears. Wallace rode between the lines, shouting encouragement, reminding each man that holding meant living, yielding meant dying. His presence, a tall silhouette amid the fray, galvanized his troops. But the enemy, relentless, advanced. By afternoon, the situation grew critical. The English archers, still at a distance, continued to mow down ranks. Where a man fell, a gap opened in the schiltron, quickly exploited by enemy infantry. Despite fierce resistance, some formations began to buckle. Wallace ordered an orderly retreat to the hill, hoping to save as many lives as possible. The retreat soon turned into a desperate fight. The English, sensing victory within reach, redoubled their ferocity. The Scots, exhausted, fell back step by step, covered by groups who sacrificed themselves to slow the pursuit. The river of blood shed that day would long mark memories. When night finally fell, Wallace had lost nearly half his men. Falkirk was a defeat, and everyone knew it. But it was not a rout. Thanks to the schiltron's discipline and the coordinated retreat, part of the army survived to fight on. In the silence of the camp, Wallace walked the ranks, placing a hand on the shoulder of the wounded, exchanging a word with those mourning a brother or friend. His own features were marked by fatigue and pain, but his voice remained firm. Today, they thought they broke us, but as long as we breathe, they have not won. This is not the end. Those simple, fiercely determined words rekindled a flickering flame, for even in the shadow of Falkirk, Wallace remained the man who refused to bend, and as long as he stood, so too would Scotland. Chapter 4. The Last Breath of Freedom. Part 1. Exile and the Hunt. After Falkirk, Scotland bore its wounds openly. The hills that had echoed with cries of victory now heard only the cautious whispers of survivors. The English retook several fortresses, reinforced garrisons, and imposed their law with renewed harshness. Hesitant lords who had joined Wallace after Stirling drifted away, seeking to preserve their estates. Wallace understood that remaining exposed would mean offering his head to the enemy. He relinquished the title of guardian of the kingdom, not out of weakness, but to preserve the cause. Officially, he was no longer at the army's head, but in practice he continued to guide the resistance from the shadows. England's campaigns grew riskier. Patrols scoured the woods. Villages were watched, roads riddled with spies. He became a phantom traveler. By night, he crossed mountain passes, forded rivers, slept in barns or under the stars. Sometimes he found refuge with loyal peasants who risked their lives to shelter him. An old woman offered him a bowl of hot soup, in a wind-battered cottage, saying nothing, but her gaze betrayed unshakable faith. Wallace drew sustenance from these simple gestures as much as from the bread he was given. But the English hunt did not relent. Edward the Fern had placed a considerable price on his head, gold, lands, and titles for whoever delivered William Wallace, dead or alive. This promise attracted not only bounty hunters, but also potential traitors among those who had once cheered him. Wallace knew it, and every handshake, every lingering glance became a silent gamble. To escape the tightening noose, he took the road to France. Some say he hoped to meet King Philip IV to secure support and men, others that he sought merely a respite, a place to catch his breath. The crossing was perilous. Contrary winds, English ships patrolling the seas, watched ports. He reached the French coast at last, greeted with curiosity tinged with suspicion. The French court, preoccupied with its own affairs, offered neither army nor gold. But Wallace won allies among knights and mercenaries who admired his tenacity. At banquets, where he spoke in a deep voice of Scotland's struggle, a respectful silence filled the halls. Yet he knew words alone would not free his land. Months passed, and the call of Scotland grew stronger. News arrived. Pockets of resistance still held, but they lacked direction. Some whispered that Wallace must return, that only he could rekindle the flame. Despite the dangers, he decided to go back. His return was discreet. In small stages, he reached the coast, avoiding major ports. On a storm-battered merchant ship, he crossed the sea again, his face hidden by a hood. When he set foot on Scottish soil, it was on a deserted beach swept by spray. There he breathed deeply the salty, cold air and swore not to let this land fall without fighting again. But the enemy was ready. The English had infiltrated the country with spies. Every village could hide an informant, every camp a potential traitor. Wallace moved by night, frequently changed paths, used the woods as a cloak. He reconnected with loyal chiefs, organizing small strikes against isolated posts. These raids reminded the English the Guardian was not dead, but they also drew more hunters to his trail. One evening, as the moon rose behind clouds, Wallace confided to a longtime companion, "I know they'll surround me eventually, but as long as one sword is raised for Scotland, my life will have been worth living." He did not know how prophetic those words would prove, for in the shadows the nets were tightening, woven as much by the enemy's hatred as by the hands of those who had once applauded him. Part 2. The Capture. The weeks following Wallace's return were a dangerous game, a constant back and forth between striking the enemy and silent escapes through hills and woods. The man knew every hidden path, every discreet ford, every grove capable of concealing a handful of men. Yet he felt the circle closing. The English no longer relied solely on troops. They bought consciences. The betrayal came from where he least expected it. Sir John Menteith, a Scottish noble, had once fought under the same banner. The exact reasons for his treachery remain veiled. Promises of gold, political pressure, personal grudge, perhaps a mix of all three. Be that as it may, Menteith had sworn loyalty to Wallace, and that loyalty turned into a trap. One August night in 1305, Wallace was near Glasgow. He he had accepted the hospitality of a small manor belonging to a sympathizer, believing he would find brief respite. Rain fell relentlessly, pounding the tiles and drowning out external sounds. In the great hall, a few torches cast flickering light on the damp stones. Wallace, seated by the fire, absently polished his claymore. His companions, exhausted, had already dozed off. The first signs of danger were almost imperceptible. A muffled creak, a breath held in the darkness of the corridor. Then suddenly, the door burst open. English soldiers, followed by Menteith's men, flooded the room. Wallace leaped to his feet, sword already raised. The fight was brief, but fiercely intense. Wallace felled 2 assailants before they could seize him. His claymore traced wide, luminous arcs in the torchlight, striking steel and flesh with equal determination. But numbers were against him. Hands closed on his arms, others struck him with cudgels. A helmet struck his temple, blurring his vision. It is said he kept fighting, even on his knees, refusing to yield. It took 4 men to wrest his sword away. Finally disarmed, he was pinned to the floor, wrists bound behind his back with thick chains. Despite the pain, he raised his head and locked eyes with Menteith, who stood in the shadows. "I didn't think England needed to buy a Scot to defeat me," he said in a deep, slow, almost disdainful voice. Menteith did not reply. Perhaps he looked away. The soldiers dragged Wallace out of the manor, pushing him into the sodden mud. Cold rain streamed down his face, but he walked upright, without a groan, each step a silent defiance. The journey to London was long and humiliating. Chained, exposed to stares, he passed through villages and towns under the jeers of some and the tears of others. In Scotland, news of his capture spread like a lengthening shadow. Some whispered he was lost. Others swore that even imprisoned, he remained unconquered in spirit. As he neared London, the reception grew more hostile. The streets filled with onlookers come to see the king's enemy, the man who had dared defy an empire. Wallace, dirty and gaunt from privation, still held himself upright. The chains were merely a weight on his wrists, not his spirit. When the heavy doors of the Tower of London finally closed behind him, silence fell. The cold, thick walls seemed to absorb every sound. There, in a narrow cell where the air smelled of damp and stone, William Wallace awaited his fate. No bars, no door could make him forget that beyond these walls Scotland still lived, and he had sown a seed no king could uproot. Part 3. The Trial and the Sacrifice. On August 23, 1305, London awoke in unusual agitation. From dawn, the streets filled with a crowd eager to see the prisoners spoken of for weeks. William Wallace, the rebel Scot, the fallen guardian. Bells tolled in the distance, and a murmur like the rumble of a far-off sea rose from the cobbled alleys. In his tower cell, Wallace rose at the sound of bolts being drawn. His guards, in tarnished cuirasses, seized him by the chains. The metal bit into his wrists, but he showed nothing. They threw a rough cloak over his shoulders before leading him outside. The fresh morning air brushed his face, mixed with the city's acrid stench. They placed him on a cart, hands still bound, and the procession moved toward Westminster Hall. The crowd pressed on both sides, some shouting insults, others, more discreet, bowing their heads in respect. Wallace looked straight ahead, silent, his gaze fixed on an invisible point in the distance. That silence, more than any cry, imposed a dignity even his enemies seemed to feel. At Westminster Hall, the trial was swift, almost a formality. The charges were ready: treason against the King of England, murders, pillaging. Wallace listened, impassive, until the judge accused him of treason against Edward the First. Then he raised his voice, deep and firm. "I never swore allegiance to the King of England. How could I betray him?" Those words hung in the air, striking the assembly with icy clarity. But the verdict was predetermined. The judge pronounced the sentence: death by hanging, disembowelment, and quartering. A punishment designed not only to kill, but to humiliate and erase the memory of its victim. They led him back through the streets, this time on foot, dragged behind horses on a wooden hurdle. The wood creaked on the cobbles, kicking up dust that mingled with sweat and dried blood. People leaned from windows, some crossing themselves, others throwing refuse. Wallace answered neither insults nor spittle. His breathing remained calm, almost measured. At Smithfield, the execution site, he raised his eyes to the sky. Heavy clouds gathered, filtering pale light. They removed his chains to bind him to the gallows. The rope tightened around his neck, but he kept his head high. The executioners performed their task with the cold brutality of men accustomed to it. Each act aimed to break the man as much as the body. Chronicles report he did not cry out, even as the ordeal reached its peak. Perhaps he thought of those Scottish hills, the scent of heather, the wind gliding over lochs. Perhaps he saw the faces of comrades fallen at Stirling or Falkirk, or perhaps simply he remained in that fierce silence that had always been his armor. When it was over, his remains were scattered to the four corners of the kingdom, a warning to anyone who dared follow his example. But this act of terror had the opposite effect. Instead of erasing his name, it etched it deeper into men's memories. In Scotland, the news spread like embers carried by the wind. In cottages, taverns, and castles, people told how Wallace faced his fate without bending. He was already painted as a martyr, an immortal hero. Peasants whispered that as long as one Scot remembered him, freedom would not die. Thus ended the life of William Wallace, but not his story. The generations that followed still carried his name on their lips, not as a defeated man, but as one who dared stand, sometimes alone, against Europe's mightiest crown. And in the wind blowing over the Highlands, some say you can still hear, carried from valley to valley, the word he shouted on so many battlefields: freedom! Some lives are measured not by their length, but by the mark they leave in the hearts of men. William Wallace did not live long enough to see Scotland free, but he lived fully enough to embody the very idea of freedom. He is remembered as a giant of courage, a man who wielded the claymore as an extension of his soul, but also as an indomitable spirit, capable of rousing a people with the sheer force of his words and example. His feats at Stirling Bridge, his audacity in campaigns against England, his stubborn refusal to bow to a foreign king, all weave the legend that has crossed centuries. But beyond battles and victories, Wallace was a man. He knew friendship and betrayal, glory and solitude. He walked through the mud of plains as on the stones of great halls, speaking with peasants as with nobles. He was neither invincible nor immortal, but his refusal to submit made him a symbol death could not extinguish. And when the wind runs over Scotland's hills, gliding through the heather and caressing the lochs, it still carries the echo of his fight. For William Wallace was not just a war leader. He was the voice of a people who, facing the shadow of empires, dared say with a clear and unshakable voice, "We will never be slaves." Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through history. I hope this tale has brought you peace and wonder. Don't forget to subscribe to Twilight Tales for more stories to guide you into a serene sleep. Take care and see you soon.